What if I told you that some of the most dangerous ideas in history did not come from monsters, killers, or tyrants, but from philosophers? Men who wrote books, built theories, and defended ideas that, under the appearance of logic and depth, went beyond almost every moral limit, because there is a kind of dark thinking that goes far beyond pessimism. It is not just saying that life is hard, empty, or absurd. It is starting to justify cruelty, violence, domination, and even human destruction, as if all of it were necessary, inevitable, or even virtuous. And the most disturbing part is that many of these philosophies did not stay on paper. They influenced movements, regimes, revolutions, and entire ways of seeing the human being. In today's video, you are going to discover some of the darkest philosophies ever defended ideas that not only faced the darkest side of existence, but often helped push history even deeper into it. Joseph de Maistre is one of those thinkers who forces the reader to face an uncomfortable truth. Political order is rarely sustained by consensus, virtue, or good intentions alone. In works like Considerations on France, Considerations sur la France, 1797, and the St. Petersburg Dialogues, Les Soirées de St. Petersbourg, 1821, he develops the idea that punishment is not a flaw of civilization, but one of its foundations. For Maistre, after the shock of the French Revolution, the great modern mistake was believing that a society could be built only on abstract principles, universal rights, and enlightenment reason. In his view, when authority loses its sacred character, violence does not disappear, it simply returns in a more chaotic, more widespread, and more destructive form. It is in this context that his most disturbing figure appears, the executioner. Maistre writes one of the most famous and darkest passages in political philosophy when he argues that all greatness, all power, all subordination rest on the executioner, because he is at once the horror and the bond of human society. The line is shocking precisely because it turns the usual moral language upside down. Instead of treating extreme punishment as a tragic exception, Maistre turns it into proof that sovereignty is real. For him, the state does not truly exist when it only advises, educates, or persuades. It fully exists when it can judge, condemn, and punish. The executioner, then, is not a stain on order. He is the sign that order has teeth. The most important thing here is to see that Maistre does not glorify violence in a crude way, as if he were celebrating cruelty for its own sake. His reasoning is more sophisticated, and that is exactly what makes it more disturbing. He believes that human nature is deeply flawed, inclined toward error, pride, and destruction. Because of that, a stable society would need visible, feared, and recognized restraints. In his thinking, public punishment takes on an almost theological role. It reminds man that he is not sovereign over himself. God, tradition, throne, and altar form a single symbolic structure. When that structure is broken, what remains is not mature freedom, but social breakdown. That is why Maistre sees the French Revolution itself as a providential punishment, not just a political advance. This view helps explain why he became one of the major names of the counter-revolution. While many modern thinkers tried to justify power through the social contract, Maistre saw that project as a dangerous fantasy. He distrusted the idea that society could be rationally manufactured, as if it were a machine. His criticism of the Universal Constitution sums this up well. A constitution made for everyone, he said, in practice serves no one. In the Maestrian view, every people is born within traditions, hierarchies, and forms of authority that cannot be reinvented without a cost. When modernity tries to erase that legacy, it ends up producing new forms of coercion, sometimes even more brutal than the old ones. Here lies one of the strongest ironies in his thought. The more the world promises total emancipation, the more it may depend on harsh systems of discipline to keep from falling apart, not historically. This idea echoes in an unsettling way. The Reign of Terror in France showed that regimes built in the name of freedom can also sink into purges and executions. Centuries later, modern states kept justifying surveillance, mass imprisonment, repression, and legal exceptions in the name of public order. Maistre did not foresee the contemporary world exactly as it is, but he did recognize something that still disturbs us. Behind the civilized language of politics, there is always the possibility of a punishing force holding up the social order. And maybe that is why he still matters. In times of fear, institutional crisis, and polarization, the temptation returns to treat those who punish as sacred, as if toughness were the same as truth and authority were the same as justice. This helps us understand not only the 19th century, but also the present and perhaps a future in which insecure societies hand even more power to institutions that promise protection in exchange for obedience. This link to the present is an inference based on the logic of Maistre's thought and on historical patterns of expanding coercive power. The darkest side of Joseph de Maistre lies exactly there. He forces us to admit that civilization does not live on noble laws alone, but also on the threat that upholds them. His philosophical strength lies in tearing away the moralistic mask of politics. His danger lies in turning that insight into a justification for the sacredness of punishment. To read Maistre is to face the question many people would rather avoid. When we defend order, what exactly are we defending? A just form of coexistence, or simply a power capable of punishing? And when a society begins to admire its instruments of punishment too much, is it still protecting humanity, or has it already begun to lose it? Max Stirner enters philosophy like a stick of dynamite thrown at almost everything that, from ancient times to modernity, had been treated as sacred. In his main work, Der Einzig und seine Gentem, 1844, known in English as The Ego and Its Own, or, more literally, the unique individual and their property, he attacks religion, the state, humanity, duty, moral truth, and any principle that presents itself as higher than the concrete individual. Stirner's target is not just one doctrine or another. It is the very idea that there is such a thing as a universal morality that can bind everyone equally. For him, when someone says you must, they are usually trying to force a unique human life to submit to an abstraction. And that is exactly where his thought becomes as dark as it is fascinating. The self owes nothing to collective essences. Instead, it can use, reinterpret, or discard all of them according to its own interest. At the center of this destruction is Stirner's criticism of what he calls spooks, or fixed ideas, God, morality, country, people, justice, man, humanity for him. All of these can act like mental ghosts that dominate consciousness. They are constructions that appear noble, but demand the sacrifice of real individuals in the name of abstract entities. Stirner sees in this a continuity between religion and secular ideologies. Even after the death of God, modern man would still be kneeling before new absolutes, such as the state, progress, or the social cause. Only the name of the altar changes. His suspicion is devastating. Many doctrines that present themselves as liberating are still, deep down, refined forms of obedience. That is why Stirner does not spare even the movements that, at first glance, seem revolutionary. He criticizes political liberalism because it replaces personal servitude with submission to the law. He criticizes socialism because it turns the collective into a new sovereign. He criticizes humanism because it replaces God with an equally tyrannical human essence. His point is simple and brutal. It does not matter whether authority speaks in the name of heaven, reason, or the people. If it demands that the individual live for something above himself, it is still domination. In that sense, Stirner is a radically anti-moral thinker. He wants to free the individual not only from the old gods, but also from the modern ones. But what remains after that demolition? What remains is the unique one, the irreducible individual who cannot be contained inside general concepts. Stirner is not simply defending vulgar selfishness, childish whim, or the mere search for immediate pleasure. What he wants to affirm is the sovereignty of singularity against every attempt at moral capture. That is where the power of his most famous line comes from. He declares that he has based his cause on nothing. The phrase does not mean passive emptiness, but an active refusal of any final external foundation. The self does not receive a mission from the universe, is not born owing loyalty to an essence, and does not need to justify itself before metaphysical courts. This refusal makes his thought deeply attractive in times tired of dogma, and deeply dangerous for any collective project that demands lasting commitment. At this point, one of Stirner's most provocative ideas appears, the union of egoists. Instead of a community based on duty, guilt, or sacrifice, he imagines free associations between individuals who cooperate only as long as it suits them. No one belongs to a cause. Each person takes part only while they still see advantage, desire, affinity, or usefulness in it. The relationship stops being sacred and becomes strategic. This breaks traditional moral language because friendship, politics, love, and solidarity are no longer eternal obligations, but revocable bonds. There is a powerful freedom in that, but also a deep instability. If everything is maintained only as long as it serves the self, then no loyalty is truly untouchable. The price of total autonomy may be the fragility of every bond. Historically, Stirner speaks to a world we still recognize. In the 19th century, he already understood that secularization would not eliminate the impulse to submit. It would only change its symbols. Today, that seems even more relevant. Ideologies, identities, digital tribes, nationalisms, activist movements, and even personal brands often work like new, fixed ideas, demanding emotional loyalty and constant vigilance. The language has changed, but the structure Stirner exposed is still alive. Individuals being pressured to dissolve themselves into narratives bigger than they are. Stirner still matters because he shows how collective language can hide power relations. The darkest side of Stirner, however, lies in what his liberation removes along with the chains. By destroying all universal morality, he also weakens the traditional foundations of shared responsibility. If there is no duty above the self, then by what authority can manipulation, betrayal, or indifference be condemned? Stirner would say that even this question is already shaped by old illusions. Even so, the discomfort remains. His philosophy reveals that many collective causes are useful fictions, but it also points toward a world in which the individual no longer recognizes anything as sacred in itself except his own power. And that is both the strength and the abyss of his thought. He invites us to tear down idols, but also forces us to face what may appear when no altar is left standing. To talk about the Marquis de Sade only as a symbol of scandal is to oversimplify a way of thinking that is, at its core, far more disturbing than his reputation as a libertine suggests. What makes Sade philosophically dark is not just moral provocation, but his attempt to build a worldview in which cruelty stops being a deviation and becomes a logical consequence of nature itself. In works like Justine, Juliet, and Philosophy in the Bedroom, he tears apart the idea that the universe has a moral order. For Sade, nature does not protect the innocent, reward virtue, or punish evil as a matter of principle. It produces life and destruction with the same indifference. So when people speak of goodness, compassion, and justice as if they were universal laws, they are really just inventing artificial rules to restrain impulses that the natural world itself does not condemn. This is the central point of his philosophy. Morality is not an eternal truth, but a human construction. Sade looks at reality and sees earthquakes, disease, war, death, domination, and suffering spread across human experience with no sign of any higher correction. If nature acts this way, he asks, why should man be any different? The provocation is brutal because it tries to remove morality from the realm of the sacred and place it in the realm of convention. What we call good and evil in this logic would be nothing more than social language created to organize coexistence and protect collective interests. In other words, morality would not be the foundation of the world, but a tool for managing life in common. And for Sade, everything that is constructed can be questioned, reversed, or destroyed. That is exactly where his thought becomes more radical. Sade does not just want to say that people are hypocrites or that society represses desire. Many before and after him said that. What he wants is something deeper, to show that the very attempt to justify virtue through nature fails. For centuries, philosophers and religious thinkers tried to support morality with the idea of a harmonious natural order. Sade acts like a saboteur of that tradition. He suggests that nature is excess, conflict, and constant transformation, not moral balance. It creates in order to destroy, and destroys in order to create. In that setting, the suffering of individuals carries no metaphysical weight. The universe does not stop to grieve human pain. This cosmic coldness is one of the harshest parts of his work, because it destroys the comfort of believing that, deep down, reality contains a justice waiting to be fulfilled. Because of this, Sade's philosophy can also be read as an attack on the illusion of civilization. Society likes to imagine itself as rational, just, and morally elevated. But Sade insists on showing that beneath the rules there is a desire for power, domination, and transgression. He exposes a wound that modernity preferred to hide, that the human being is not naturally good, not naturally moderate, and not spontaneously guided by compassion. When institutions, religions, and customs try to discipline this energy, they do not eliminate the impulse. They only cover it with noble language. Sade forces the reader to face what culture prefers to keep out of sight, the closeness between civilization and violence, between social refinement and repressed brutality. His work is disturbing because, at its core, it says that moral order may be far less solid than it seems at the same time. There is a dangerous reversal in Sade. Instead of merely describing a world indifferent to suffering, he often pushes that indifference toward a kind of philosophical justification. That is the darkest leap in his thinking. It is one thing to say that nature has no morality. It is another thing entirely to suggest that human beings may therefore act as if ethical limits have no real value. This is the point where Sade stops being only a critic of hypocrisy and moves closer to a philosophy of moral collapse. If pain carries no cosmic meaning and rules are artificial, then why respect them? In Sade, this question does not appear as despair, but as a challenge. And that is what has made his work endure through the centuries as an intellectual scandal. It does not want to reform morality, but to show that morality may have no deeper foundation than fear, habit, and convenience. Historically, this way of thinking was born at a time when Europe was watching its old religious and political foundations begin to collapse. The crisis of absolutism, the impact of the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution opened space for questions that once seemed unthinkable. If traditional authority can fall, why should moral authority remain untouched? Sade takes that impulse to the extreme, where other Enlightenment thinkers still believed in reason, progress, and a nature compatible with human dignity. He presents a dark version of freedom, a freedom without moral essence, without higher purpose, and without any guarantee of humanity. In that sense, he anticipates problems that would later return in debates about nihilism, relativism, and dehumanization. What makes Sade still relevant is that his provocation remains alive, even in less explicit forms. Whenever a culture reduces other people's suffering to a statistical detail, whenever efficiency matters more than dignity, whenever power justifies itself by saying, "That's just how the world works," something of Sade's logic comes back. Not because everyone has read Sade, but because his question is still open. If nature is indifferent, where do we get the obligation to be just? That is the wound he leaves behind. His thought is not just a praise of transgression. It is an attempt to prove that human morality is not written into the fabric of the universe. And maybe that is exactly why he remains so disturbing. Because by denying that the world has compassion, he forces the human being to decide alone whether he still wants to have it. Thomas Carlyle is an unsettling case because his philosophy does not defend hierarchy merely as a practical necessity, but almost as a law of human reality itself. In books like On Heroes, Hero Worship, and The Heroic in History, 1841, and Past and Present, 1843, he insists that society is not truly organized through equality, but through the recognition of real forms of superiority, strength of character, spiritual greatness, ability to lead, historical energy. For Carlyle, modernity made a mistake when it started believing that everyone could symbolically occupy the same political and moral place. That faith in equality seemed to him like a dangerous illusion because it ignored what he thought was obvious. Some are born with a calling to lead, while many others need to be guided. His philosophy of order is born exactly from this conviction that human beings are unequal by nature. The most famous expression of this view appears in his Cult of the Hero. Carlyle does not use the word hero only in an epic or military sense. For him, a hero is an exceptional man capable of seeing farther than his own time and giving form to chaos. He may be a prophet, poet, king, priest, or political leader. What matters is that history, in Carlyle's reading, is not mainly driven by the masses, parliaments, or collective decision-making, but by extraordinary individuals. This idea seems attractive because it gives politics a dramatic and almost spiritual meaning. But it comes at a high cost. When greatness is placed above equality, obedience stops being treated as a moral problem and starts being seen as a virtue. The person being ruled no longer appears as a full citizen, but as someone who must recognize his lower place before those who are born to command. That is what makes Carlyle so dark. He is not simply saying that strong leadership matters. Many philosophers have said that. What he suggests is that the very idea of popular government carries something artificial, maybe even ridiculous, when compared to the living authority of a great man. His hostility toward egalitarianism is tied to a frequent contempt for liberal abstraction. Votes, legal formulas, and the language of rights would not be enough to organize a nation in crisis. In many moments, Carlyle contrasts the real man of action with formal institutions that speak in the name of everyone, but that, in his eyes, often hide mediocrity, cowardice, and disorder. The result is clear. When legitimacy no longer rests on political equality and instead rests on the superiority of the strong, the door to authoritarianism is already half open. This logic also appears in his almost religious defense of work, discipline, and social authority. In Past and Present, Carlyle looks at the English industrial world and sees not only economic injustice, but moral disintegration. He believes modern society suffers because it has lost organic bonds of duty and subordination. Instead of an order in which everyone knows their place, what emerged was a world ruled by calculation, self-interest, and social breakdown. The problem is that Carlyle's answer to this collapse is not more freedom, but more direction. Not deep democratization, but the rebuilding of authority. His critique of the present has force, because it recognizes the spiritual emptiness of industrial modernity. But his solution moves toward a politics of command, reverence. and submission to the more fit. The most brutal side of this philosophy appears when we leave the abstract level and look at his concrete positions. In the essay known as Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, 1849, later renamed On the Nigger Question, Carlyle defended the coercion of black labor in the colonies and attacked emancipation as if it had destroyed a legitimate order of command. This text is one of the most shocking documents in his work because it shows that his defense of hierarchy was not only metaphysical or moral, it could descend into the racial and colonial world with open violence. The idea that some are born to rule and others to obey took on, there, a cruel historical form. In Carlyle, authoritarianism was not some side accident. It was rooted in his view of unequal humanity. Historically, this helps explain why Carlyle influenced so many readers fascinated by the figure of the strong leader. His praise of authority, his distrust of the masses, and his reverence for command shaped part of the modern political imagination. He cannot be automatically reduced to the totalitarian movements of the 20th century. But his philosophy offered a dangerous language, the idea that social crisis is solved when natural superiors reclaim the place that belongs to them. In times of fear, institutional decline, and exhaustion with ordinary politics, this kind of message returns with force. The promise is always similar: less debate, more decision; less equality, more order; less plurality, more command. This connection to later developments is a historical inference based on the central themes of his work and the way critics have interpreted his legacy. Reading Carlyle today is uncomfortable, precisely because he expresses, with great literary power, a permanent temptation in political life, the temptation to trade equal dignity for a hierarchy presented as natural, efficient, and even noble. His thought touches on something real societies do fall apart when no one takes responsibility, but it turns that partial truth into a harsh philosophy of human inequality. And that is where the danger lies. Once we begin to believe that some are born to rule and others to obey, authority stops being a temporary function and becomes destiny. From that moment on, power no longer needs to justify itself before human beings. It only has to claim that it is simply carrying out the natural order of things. Julius Evola takes philosophical darkness into a different territory from authors who praised only brute force or political repression. In his case, what appears is something more ambitious and more dangerous, an attempt to give inequality a spiritual foundation. In works like Revolt Against the Modern World and Men Among the Ruins, Evola argues that modernity does not represent progress, but decline. Equality, democracy, bourgeois individualism, mass society, and the cult of comfort would all be signs of a civilization that has lost contact with a higher, transcendent, and hierarchical principle. Instead of seeing history as a path of liberation, he reads it as a fall. The more modern the world becomes, the farther it moves from what he calls tradition, understood not as ordinary custom, but as a sacred order that existed before the modern world. This is where the core of his spiritual elitism appears. For Evola, human beings should not be seen as equal, either in political dignity or in inner calling. He imagines traditional society as a vertical structure made up of different human types, in which only a few embody a higher form of existence. These few would be connected to discipline, self-mastery, the ability to lead, and a spiritual dimension that the masses can no longer even understand. Hierarchy, then, would not be merely social. It would be ontological, almost metaphysical. This is not just about rich and poor, rulers and ruled, but about a division between those who take part in a higher order of being and those who live trapped in the material world, in desire, fear, and passivity. That is why Evola despises democracy so deeply. In his view, Rule by the masses does not elevate ordinary people. Instead, it turns mediocrity into a system. When quantity replaces quality, when numbers matter more than excellence, politics stops being the expression of a higher order and becomes the management of the herd. Universal voting, the language of equal rights, and popular legitimacy would be, for him, symptoms of an upside-down world, where what should obey begins to rule. In many of his writings, Evola contrasts the aristocratic figure disciplined and oriented upward with the modern mass man, focused on comfort, safety, and material satisfaction. His anti-democratic view is not incidental. It stands at the center of his system knot. This helps explain why his work comes so close to authoritarian worldviews. Evola did not admire mass modernity, even when it took nationalist forms. He even saw fascism and Nazism as incomplete or insufficiently traditional in many ways, precisely because they still depended on popular mobilization, plebeian language, and modern elements. Even so, he saw these movements as possible tools for fighting liberalism, egalitarianism, and modern disintegration. That makes his position even more unsettling. In a certain sense, he stood to the right of the authoritarian right of his own time, judging it not aristocratic enough and not spiritual enough. Another dark feature of his thought is the way he idealizes castes and higher orders. Instead of understanding ancient hierarchies as debatable historical constructions, Evola treats them as reflections of a legitimate cosmic structure. Kings, warriors, nobles, and initiatic elites appear in his work as expressions of true authority, different from modern power based on public opinion, money, or propaganda. There is, here, a nostalgia for empire, aristocracy, and warrior discipline, but wrapped in spiritual language. This matters. In Evola, inequality is not justified only by efficiency or political tradition, but by an alleged inner superiority. That kind of argument is especially harsh because it turns privilege into destiny and obedience into the natural order of the spirit. This philosophy left marks beyond its own time. After World War II, Evola remained influential in sectors of the Italian far right and in later radical movements, precisely because he offered something many reactionary groups were looking for, a justification that was not only political, but almost sacred, for rejecting equality, pluralism, and the modern world. His language of decline, virility, ruin, and the restoration of a superior elite still attracts groups that see democracy as weakness and diversity as a sign of collapse. The persistence of this influence has been highlighted by academic studies and by recent analyses of the reach of radical traditionalism. On the contemporary right, the most disturbing part of Julius Evola is that he turns exclusion into elevation. Instead of openly defending naked brutality, he sublimates it. The masses are not just seen as incapable. They are treated as inferior in essence. Equality is not only rejected as impractical, it is attacked as a spiritual error. And modernity is not criticized only for its excesses, but condemned as an almost total civilizational collapse. To read Evola is to enter a universe in which political compassion looks like weakness, rights look like decay, and the shared dignity of human beings looks like a modern illusion. That is why his philosophy remains so dark, because it offers an elegant, scholarly, and mystical way to justify a world in which a few command, many obey, and inequality stops being a problem and becomes a principle. Georges Sorel is one of those thinkers who changes the moral weight of a word. In his hands, violence stops meaning only disorder, brutality, or the failure of politics, and begins to be presented as a regenerative force. In Reflections on Violence, 1908, his best-known work, Sorel builds a deeply unsettling vision, the idea that a class or a people can recover its moral strength precisely when it abandons comfort and embraces confrontation. In this framework, violence does not appear as a simple tool for gaining power, but as an energy that purifies, hardens, and restores historical seriousness to a collective body. That reversal is what makes his philosophy so dark. He does not mourn violence as a tragic necessity. He raises it to the level of a formative principle. To understand Sorel, it is important to see that he was writing against a certain climate of political compromise. He distrusted parliamentarianism, reformism, and the belief that social conflict could be tamed through gradual agreements. In his view, that kind of politics weakens the working class because it gets them used to negotiating benefits instead of asserting their historical strength. For him, the problem was not only strategic, but moral. Sorel believed that concessions, compromise, and accommodation dissolved the fighting spirit of a class. When struggle is absorbed by the institutional machine, what is lost is not only political radicalism, but spiritual integrity. Revolutionary violence, then, appears as a refusal of that softening. It would be proof that there is still a collective will that has not been captured by the bourgeois order. That is why Sorel gives so much importance to the myth of the general strike. Here, myth does not mean a simple lie or a conscious manipulation. It means a mobilizing image, a total vision capable of concentrating passion, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice. For him, the general strike matters not only as an economic plan or a union tactic. It matters as an image of absolute rupture between classes, as a horizon that organizes revolutionary will. Instead of technical arguments or detailed programs, Sorel places his hope in a representation charged with emotion and intensity. This is one of the most modern and also most dangerous parts of his thought. He understands that people are not moved only by cold reason, but by images that set them on fire. And when those images become tied to violence, politics stops being negotiation and becomes moral combat. What is most disturbing is that Sorel sets violence against force in a very specific way. According to standard readings of his work, force refers to the coercive machinery of the state and the bourgeois order, while proletarian violence is the revolutionary denial of that order. This distinction allows Sorel to present violence not as a simple mirror of oppression, but as something morally superior, because it would come from a refusal of compromise and a direct affirmation of class struggle. In other words, he tries to purify violence by placing it on the side of historical authenticity. The danger is not hard to see. Once violence starts being seen as more truthful than political mediation, everything that slows down confrontation can begin to look like decay, cowardice, or betrayal. There is in Sorel a kind of ethic of hardness. The revolutionary class would become truly strong only when it freed itself from the illusion of reconciliation and accepted conflict as its destiny. Violence would then take on an almost ascetic role, to discipline, strip away illusions, and create stronger men. This helps explain why his work could fascinate very different people. Although he came out of revolutionary syndicalism, reflections on violence ended up influencing Marxist readers, as well as sectors that later fed fascist political imaginaries. This does not mean reducing Sorel automatically to fascism, but it does show how his celebration of energy, myth, and confrontation opened the door to authoritarian uses. His language of regeneration through violence was broad, enough to escape the political field where it began. Historically, this idea had deep consequences in the 20th century. Whenever political movements began speaking of violence as catharsis, as proof of vitality, or as a cure for decline, something Sorelian reappeared. The belief that tired societies need shock, that softened peoples need conflict in order to be reborn, that moral purity returns only when the enemy is faced without compromise. All of this carries echoes of his philosophy. That does not mean every political use of violence comes from Sorel, but it helps explain why he remains so central in discussions of radicalization, mass mobilization, and the cult of confrontation. This link to later developments is a historical inference widely supported by the critical reception of his work. The darkest side of Georges Sorel lies exactly in turning violence into a standard of moral elevation. Instead of asking how to contain the destructive cycle of antagonism, he asks how to preserve it so that a class will not lose its fighting soul. Politics, then, no longer seeks only justice, stability, or freedom. It seeks intensity. And when intensity becomes the highest value, human suffering runs the risk of being reduced to a side effect of a greater purification. To read Sorel is to face a recurring temptation in history, the temptation to believe that a people becomes nobler when it is hardened by struggle. The question his work leaves open remains. Dangerous even today, when a community begins to call violence regeneration. Is it still saving itself, or has it already begun to surrender to the fascination of destruction? Carl Schmitt is one of the darkest thinkers in modern political thought because he shifts the center of public life to a point of rupture. Instead of defining politics as the pursuit of the common good, the management of coexistence, or the art of agreement, he reduces it to the moment when a group decisively distinguishes between friend and enemy. This idea appears most clearly in the concept of the political, where Schmitt argues that the distinction between friend and enemy is the specific criterion of the political. With that, politics stops being understood mainly as negotiation and starts being understood as the real possibility of conflict between collective groups. This is not just about differences of opinion, but about identifying an other who may, in the extreme case, have to be fought. It is exactly this extreme case that gives Schmitt's thought both its power and its danger. For him, every political theory that tries to neutralize conflict through procedures, parliaments, consensus, and universal norms is in the end hiding the true essence of politics. Liberalism in particular seemed to him incapable of understanding the seriousness of the historical world because it replaced existential decisions with endless debate. Where the liberal sees discussion, compromise, and institutional balance, Schmitt sees indecision. Where the liberal sees pluralism, he sees a refusal to admit that every political order must know who belongs and who threatens it. His criticism is powerful because it touches on something real. Societies do not live by abstract norms alone. In moments of crisis, someone always decides. But that is exactly where his philosophy becomes dark, because it turns that fact into a foundation. Schmitt is not just saying that enemies exist. He is saying that without the possibility of naming them, politics loses its proper form. That changes everything. The opponent stops being someone you struggle against within shared rules and becomes the one whose very otherness threatens the unity of the political body. Politics, then, is no longer the space where differences live together under common institutions, but the field where a collective affirms its identity by deciding against whom it defines itself. In this framework, exclusion does not appear as a morally regrettable accident. It appears as a constitutive act. A political group knows who it is because it knows who cannot remain within it without creating danger. When this logic becomes more extreme, the line between governing and persecuting begins to disappear. This view connects directly to another central idea in Schmitt's thought: sovereignty has the power to decide on the exception. In Political Theology, 1922, he famously writes that sovereign is the one who decides on the state of exception. That means true political authority does not reveal itself in the normal routine of law, but in the moment when order is suspended in order to save order itself. In other words, law is not self-sufficient. At some point, it depends on a decision that comes from outside normal legal life. This thesis had enormous influence because it reveals how fragile every legal system becomes in times of emergency. At the same time, it opens a dangerous path. If the sovereign gains legitimacy, precisely when he can suspend the rules in the name of collective survival, then the enemy can become the key that justifies the extraordinary. Expansion of power, not the historical weight of this way of thinking, becomes even more serious when we remember Schmidt's own trajectory. After 1933, he joined Nazism, entered the Nazi Party, and held an influential position in the legal world of the regime, to the point that he came to be seen as one of its major intellectual legitimizers. Academic and encyclopedic sources record that he helped provide theoretical support for the Nazi seizure of power and justified authoritarian measures taken by the regime. That does not mean every reading of Schmitt leads automatically to totalitarianism, but it prevents any innocent view of the political use of his categories. When politics is understood through the sovereign decision about the enemy, the temptation to turn opponents into existential threats grows in a brutal way. That is why Schmitt still feels relevant today. In times of polarization, institutional crisis, and collective fear, his logic returns very easily. Movements of all kinds can be tempted to replace the language of the opponent with the language of the enemy, because that shift brings intensity, unity, and a feeling of moral clarity. When that happens, politics stops managing conflicts among citizens and begins looking for foreign bodies to expel, silence, or neutralize. This application to the present is an inference based on the structure of Schmitt's thought and on the way it has been received in contemporary debates. Not a literal thesis he stated in those exact terms, the most disturbing side of Carl. Schmitt lies precisely in this seduction of clarity. His thought offers a hard answer to chaos. Every community must decide who we are and who they are. The problem is that, once this becomes the essence of politics, the space for coexistence begins to shrink. Negotiation starts to look like weakness, pluralism starts to look like disorder, and exclusion starts to look like historical necessity. Schmitt saw something true about power. No order survives without decision. But by reducing politics to the ability to identify and confront the enemy, he pushes it into a territory where unity always depends on a threat, and a society that continually needs enemies in order to know who it is may already be starting to lose the very idea of shared humanity. Donoso Cortés begins with a brutal conviction. There are moments when a society, overwhelmed by fear, revolt, and disorder, can no longer be saved by freedom. At that point, according to him, power no longer has the duty to persuade, it has the duty to crush. That is the backbone of one of the darkest political philosophies of the 19th century. For Donoso, dictatorship does not appear as an abnormality within order, but as an extreme remedy when the political body goes into convulsions. What in other thinkers appears as a risk or a tragedy, in him appears as a necessity. In the face of chaos, freedom is not sacred. It can be suspended, restricted, and destroyed if that is the price of preserving authority. What makes this way of thinking so harsh is that it does not come from a simple taste for oppression, but from a dramatic reading of modern history. Donoso believed that Europe was entering an age of deep crisis, in which old religious certainties were collapsing, authority was losing legitimacy, and revolutions were gaining strength. In his view, this process did not mean political maturity, but decomposition. Modernity had supposedly freed man from absolute truths, only to hand him over to doubt, agitation, and permanent conflict. Once belief in a higher order disappears, he argued, the basis that supports obedience disappears with it. And when obedience weakens, power begins to falter precisely at the moment when it most needs to assert itself. That is why Donoso distrusted liberalism so deeply. For him, liberalism is the regime of hesitation. While others fight with faith, conviction, and a willingness to go all the way, the liberal debates, delays, negotiates, and tries to reconcile sides that no longer want reconciliation. This criticism is central to his philosophy. The problem is not only that liberalism is moderate. The problem is that it would be incapable of acting with force in an age of extremes. Donoso sees parliamentarism as a theater of words in a world that has already entered a state of moral war. Public debate, plurality of opinion, and institutional limits no longer seem like signs of civilization, but symptoms of weakness. When crisis becomes more radical, he believes that talking too much can become just another way of failing to govern. This view becomes even more intense because Donoso does not separate politics from theology. For him, every political order rests on a religious vision of the world, even when it no longer admits it. Human authority depends on a higher authority. When God is removed from the center, what remains is not neutrality, but instability. Modern man believes he can found order on reason, law, or consensus alone, but Donoso sees that as an illusion. Laws and institutions by themselves would not have enough force to contain historical violence when it breaks loose. In times of normality, this may remain hidden, but in moments of rupture, the truth becomes clear. Every society must decide who rules in whose name and with what power. And for him, in those moments, liberal freedom proves incapable of answering. It is in this setting that dictatorship appears as a legitimate solution, not as a beautiful ideal, and not as a desirable form in peaceful times, but as a necessary instrument when society can no longer be preserved by ordinary means. Donoso believes that in the face of anarchy, revolution, and the threat of collapse, the ruler has the right and even the obligation to act without normal restraints. The exception overrides the rule. Authority comes before deliberation. Order matters more than freedom. Here lies the dark core of his thought. Freedom stops being an inviolable principle and becomes a conditional good, allowed only as long as it does not threaten the very existence of society. If it does, it can be taken away. But there is something even more disturbing in this logic. Donoso does not treat the crushing of freedom as a regrettable moral failure. He treats it as lucidity. That is the decisive difference. Many people admit that states, in extreme situations, end up resorting to force. Donoso goes further. He argues that this force may be the only honest response when historical evil is advancing. Instead of seeing dictatorship as the shame of politics, he presents it as a higher form of decision in the face of the abyss. The strong ruler no longer appears as a tyrant, but as a cruel yet necessary doctor who wounds in order to save the whole organism. That implicit metaphor runs through his thought. Better to suffocate freedom by an act of power than to allow society as a whole to sink into decomposition. This philosophy feeds on an almost apocalyptic view of conflict. In Donoso courts, political struggle is not a manageable disagreement between rival projects. It is a clash between order and dissolution, between authority and ruin, between civilization and the abyss. When the world is seen in those terms, tolerance loses its value. The adversary is no longer someone to defeat within shared rules, but a corrosive force threatening to destroy the basis of coexistence. And once politics takes on that absolute form, repression no longer seems excessive. It begins to seem inevitable. That is why Donoso remains so unsettling. His philosophy touches a temptation that returns every time society falls into panic. The temptation to believe that freedom has gone too far, that debate has weakened power, and that only unchecked authority can restore order. What he offers is an intellectual justification for that impulse. Not an irrational burst of authoritarianism, but a structured theory in which despotism can appear as a historical duty. To read Donoso courts is to face a question too dangerous to ignore. What is a people willing to destroy within itself in order to keep existing? His answer is cold. If one must choose between freedom and the survival of order, then freedom must fall first. And that is exactly what makes his thoughts so dark. In his hands, tyranny does not appear as the sin of politics, but as its possible salvation. Sergey Nechayev, pushes revolutionary logic to a point where the person himself has to disappear. In his most famous text, The Catechism of a Revolutionary, 1869, he describes the ideal militant as a doomed man with no personal interests, no business, no feelings, no property, and no name. Everything in him must be absorbed by a single passion, the revolution. This idea is more than political radicalism. It represents an attempt to destroy every trace of private humanity in the name of the cause. In Nechayev, the revolutionary is not someone who fights for an ideal while still keeping human bonds. He is someone who cuts those bonds off at the root in order to become a pure instrument of transformation. That is what makes his thought so dark. Many revolutionaries accepted sacrifice, secrecy, and risk. Nechayev goes further. He demands a kind of inner death in advance. The militant must not only give up comfort, he must give up identity. He must not only control his emotions, he must distrust them. He must not only place personal morality beneath the struggle, he must stop recognizing any morality other than the usefulness of revolutionary destruction. In this universe, friendship, compassion, spontaneous loyalty, and moral scruples become dangerous weaknesses because they can slow down the effectiveness of action. The concrete person has to be remade into a machine of war. The central point of his vision lies in the idea that revolution cannot be made by ordinary people who are still tied to the moral habits of the old world. For Nechayev, the true revolutionary must study society the way someone studies enemy territory, identify cracks, exploit fears, use relationships, manipulate vanity, and mobilize anything that can speed up the collapse of the existing order. Knowledge no longer has contemplative or formative value. It matters only as a technique of destruction. It is no accident that the Catechism itself says the revolutionary rejects peaceful doctrine and knows only one science, the science of destruction. That line sums up his spirit well. Intelligence should not seek truth, but corrosive effectiveness. What we see here is a deep transformation of ethics into strategy. Instead of asking whether an act is just, Nechayev asks whether it is useful. Instead of asking whether a relationship is human, he asks whether it can be exploited. Instead of asking whether a comrade deserves trust, he judges whether that comrade is still useful to the progress of the conspiracy. This creates one of the coldest figures in the history of political ideas. The militant with no recognizable inner life, living behind disguises, using people as tools, and treating even those closest to him as disposable pieces. The cause no longer guides life, it consumes it completely. And once that happens, the revolutionary is no longer only fighting the old world. He starts reproducing within himself an extreme form of dehumanization. Nechayev's own life makes this philosophy even more disturbing. Britannica records that he organized a small secret revolutionary group, demanded unconditional submission to the will of the leader, and was connected to the murder of Ivan Ivanov, a member who challenged his methods. This historical fact is decisive because it shows that his doctrine did not remain at the level of fiery rhetoric. The logic of the militant without attachments created, in practice, an environment where internal suspicion, absolute discipline, and the elimination of dissent became almost natural consequences. When the cause is everything, the one who hesitates is no longer merely weak, he becomes an obstacle. And in that grammar, obstacles are removed. This model of the revolutionary had a historical effect that went beyond Nechayev himself. Historical sources note that the figure of the professional revolutionary, drawn in almost demonic form in the Catechism, would later reappear in other Russian political traditions, including as a distant reference point for more organized forms of secrecy and party discipline. That does not mean Nechayev alone explains the revolutionary 20th century, but it does show that he anticipated a very important political type, the fully devoted cadre, conspiratorial, trained to obey, and ready to treat common morality as a bourgeois illusion. Political modernity would come to know many versions of this figure. Maybe the most disturbing part of Nechayev is that his philosophy hijacks even the language of idealism. On the surface, everything seems driven by a higher goal: liberation, justice, the total transformation of society. But inside the Nechayevist machine, the ideal serves to justify a process of emptying out the person. The militant no longer belongs to himself, no longer feels for himself, no longer thinks for himself. He becomes a function. His great renunciation is not luxury, but ordinary human life itself, made of bonds, doubts, memories, and moral limits. The cause, which promised historical redemption, first demands an inner mutilation. To read Nechayev is to face a question that still feels frighteningly current. What happens when a political project demands that the individual stop being a person and become only an instrument? His thought shows the point where conviction turns into fanaticism and discipline turns into self-erasure. The revolutionary with no name, no emotional ties, and no personal morality seems powerful because nothing distracts him. But maybe his real tragedy lies exactly there. In order to defeat the old world, he agrees to destroy within himself everything that would make that victory truly human. Arthur de Gobineau is one of the darkest figures in the history of ideas because he tries to do something that goes beyond ordinary prejudice. He attempts to turn racial inequality into a law of civilization. In his most influential work, An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, Gobineau argues that humanity is divided into major hierarchical races, and that the white race, especially what he called the Aryan element, was the true source of the highest civilizations. This is not just racial hostility. It is an attempt to turn hierarchy into a kind of historical metaphysics, as if the destiny of peoples were written in blood. What makes this philosophy especially disturbing is that Gobineau does not present inequality as a fixable accident, the result of unjust institutions or historical circumstances. For him, inequality is built into humanity itself. Different peoples are not in different positions because of political, economic, or military processes, but because they carry unequal capacities within their own racial makeup. That shift is decisive. Once prejudice becomes a theory of history, injustice stops looking like a scandal and starts looking like destiny. Domination no longer needs moral justification. It only has to claim that it expresses the natural order of things. Gobineau builds this view around one central obsession: purity and degeneration. According to reconstructions by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Britannica, he argued that civilization was born from the white race and that its decline began when that race mixed with others. There is a revealing contradiction here. Stanford notes that, in his own theory, the white race itself would have come from an earlier successful mixture, while later mixtures were treated as decline. The result is a narrative in which every form of historical greatness seems threatened by contamination. Race mixing stops being seen as human contact and starts being treated as a mechanism of ruin. In this way, Gobineau provides an intellectual grammar for racial fear. The other is not just different, but a carrier of decay. This theory is also dark because it reduces entire peoples to the status of passive historical material. Britannica summarizes that Gobineau assigned radically unequal civilizational value to what he saw as the three great races: white, black, and yellow, reserving the creative role for the white race and placing the others in inferior positions. In readings preserved by the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he went so far as to describe Africans as incapable of civilization in the terms he considered valid, turning brutal stereotypes into the language of historical diagnosis. The effect of this is devastating. Real cultures, with their works, experiences, and ways of life, are dissolved into fixed racial labels. The singular human being disappears. Only the category remains. There is also an important element of pessimism in Gobineau. His theory is not only racist, it is fatalistic. If civilizations depend on a superior racial composition, and if that composition inevitably decays over time, then historical decline becomes almost irreversible. This is not a philosophy of progress, but a philosophy of loss. Peoples do not rise through education, justice, or political creation. They only express for a time the quality of their racial stock until that stock deteriorates. That turns history into a biological drama rather than an open human construction. Politics gives way to fate. Morality gives way to heredity. Historically, the reach of this work was deep and dangerous. It is often noted that Gobineau's idea of Aryan superiority helped feed the later dogma of Aryanism and influenced German nationalist currents, while discussions of pan-Germanism show that his ideas were used by writers who celebrated supposed Nordic or Germanic superiority. That does not mean Gobineau alone is responsible for later racist ideologies, nor that his work is identical to Nazism. But it does mean that he provided a crucial piece of the intellectual arsenal that would later try to turn racial supremacy into a total vision of history. The most unsettling thing about Gobineau is his appearance of seriousness. He does not speak like a vulgar agitator, but like someone trying to explain the course of civilizations. And that is exactly why his philosophy is so dangerous. It dresses prejudice in the language of science, scholarship, and grand historical interpretation. When that move works, racism stops looking like a low passion and starts circulating as if it were clear-sighted truth. The symbolic violence grows because it can now claim neutrality. It is no longer hatred, but description. No longer exclusion, but recognition of some supposed natural truth. That is how dehumanizing ideas gain an appearance of depth. To read Gobineau today is to face one of the most poisonous temptations of modern thought, the desire to explain human history through fixed essences and natural hierarchies. His system seems to offer order, clarity, and destiny, but the price of that clarity is monstrous. Entire peoples are imprisoned inside racial categories. Inequality becomes necessity, and shared human dignity disappears under the weight of a biological fiction. That is why his work remains so dark, because it shows how prejudice, once turned into a philosophy of history, stops being only a moral error and starts aspiring to the status of an unavoidable truth. Houston Stewart Chamberlain represents an even darker step within philosophies of inequality, because, with him, racism stops appearing as just a biological theory and begins to take on an almost religious aura. In his best-known work, The Foundations of the 19th Century, Chamberlain tries to explain the greatness of Europe as the result of the creative action of the Aryan peoples, especially the Germanic ones, while assigning the Jewish element a corrosive and negative role. His proposal is not only historical, but metaphysical. Entire civilizations come to be interpreted as expressions of deep racial and spiritual essences. Culture, then, no longer comes from human encounters, political conflicts, institutions, or concrete historical experiences. It becomes the unfolding of an inherited inner substance. That is what makes Chamberlain so disturbing. He is not simply repeating a social prejudice from his time, but trying to raise it to the level of a total key to history. Instead of asking why certain peoples prosper, create, or dominate under specific circumstances, he starts from the idea that these capacities are already written into race itself. The explanation of culture shifts to another level. It stops being historical and becomes almost ontological. Peoples are treated as carriers of a fixed collective soul, and that soul supposedly determines art, religion, politics, and destiny. Once that happens, the individual human being disappears. A person is no longer seen as an open being, capable of growth, choice, and change. He becomes a passing expression of an ancestral essence. The central point of his philosophy is exactly this fusion of race and spirit. Chamberlain is not satisfied with speaking only of physical superiority or biological capacity. He wants to show that certain races carry an inner calling toward civilizational creation, while others are linked to sterility, decline, or disintegration. That makes his theory seem more sophisticated than a purely zoological racism, but the effect is even more dangerous. Once inequality is presented as spiritual, it gains moral and symbolic depth. It is no longer just said that a people is inferior in strength or intelligence. It is suggested that they belong to a lower level of being. Hierarchy, then, stops looking contingent and starts looking like part of the inner structure of the world itself. This logic becomes even darker in the way Chamberlain treats Jews. Reference sources point out that he held a fanatical anti-Semitism and built it directly into his interpretation of European culture. Jews stop being seen as just a religious or historical group and are instead presented as an essentially negative presence, almost like a principle of dissolution inside civilization. That shift is decisive. Once hostility no longer targets beliefs, practices, or concrete conflicts, and instead targets a racial essence, the other can no longer be persuaded, assimilated, or understood. He becomes a permanent problem. That is how a cultural theory turns into a machine of exclusion. The enemy is no longer someone who thinks differently, but someone whose very existence supposedly threatens the spiritual integrity of civilization. There is also in Chamberlain a strong idealization of Germanness. Britannica notes that he explained European achievements, domination, and even the strength of the 19th century as the result of the accomplishments of the German people, even though he himself was born in England. That shows his thought was not simple patriotism, but an attempt to turn German identity into the metaphysical axis of Western history. The German people appear as guardians of a higher calling, almost as the bearers of a civilizational mission. This narrative is powerful because it offers pride, meaning, and collective destiny. But its cost is clear. If one people embodies the spiritual height of civilization, then others come to exist only as inferior contrast, as noise, deviation, or threat to the legitimate historical body. Historically, this philosophy was far more than an obscure scholarly curiosity. Sources such as Britannica and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum show that Chamberlain helped feed the racial imagination that would later be absorbed and radicalized by Nazism. The Holocaust did not come from one author alone, and it would be wrong to reduce that catastrophe to one simple direct line. But Chamberlain provided something crucial, a language in which race, culture, destiny, and purity appeared unified in a total worldview. That worldview made it plausible to think of history as a struggle between unequal and incompatible collective essences. Once a society begins to see civilization that way, exclusion stops looking like a crime and starts presenting itself as a necessary defense of the historical spirit itself. The most disturbing thing about Chamberlain is his appearance of intellectual elegance. He does not speak like a crude street agitator, but like someone offering a grand cultural synthesis. And that is exactly what makes his philosophy so poisonous. Prejudice no longer appears as a low passion, but as an elevated interpretation of art, religion, politics, and history. The symbolic violence becomes stronger because it can now wear the mask of depth. It is no longer mere hatred. It becomes a supposed explanation of the world. And once racism takes that form, it becomes harder to recognize for those who already want to believe in natural hierarchies or in the spiritual mission of certain peoples. To read Houston Stewart Chamberlain today is to face one of the most dangerous temptations of modern thought, the temptation to replace human complexity with fixed civilizational essences. His system seems to offer clarity in a confusing world. It tells us who creates, who corrupts, who elevates, and who drags things downward. But that clarity is false and brutal. By turning culture into racial and spiritual destiny, Chamberlain erases encounter, mixture, invention, and shared dignity. The world stops being divided between people and starts being divided between supposedly superior, and inferior human substances. And that is exactly why his philosophy remains so dark, because it tries to convince us that civilization is not the shared work of humanity, but the almost sacred property of an essence that supposedly has the right to dominate and exclude. Thomas Malthus is a dark thinker not because he openly celebrates cruelty, but because he turns misery into a structural part of human life. In an essay on the principle of population, first published in 1798, he presents a thesis that has lasted for centuries, precisely because of how harsh it is. Population tends to grow faster than the means of subsistence. In his classic language, population grows in geometric progression, while food can grow only in arithmetic progression. The consequence is brutal. Hunger, poverty, disease, and mass death stop appearing as fixable abnormalities and start being treated as almost inevitable checks on a species that is always pushing against the limits of its own survival. What makes this philosophy especially unsettling is that Malthus shifts misery out of the realm of injustice and into the realm of necessity. Before him, it was possible to look at poverty mainly as the product of bad institutions, unequal distribution, tyranny, or the moral failure of rulers. Malthus does not completely deny those factors, but he changes the focus. For him, even in a situation of social improvement, population growth would tend to wipe out those gains, because more people would be competing for resources that do not grow at the same pace. Scarcity, then, would not be a historical exception. It would be the permanent background of the human condition. That gives his thought an almost tragic tone. Social life does not naturally move toward shared abundance, but toward a limit where too many births meet the insufficiency of the means of life. That is why Malthus also wrote against the optimists of his time. His essay responded directly to authors like William Godwin and Condorcet, who imagined futures of broader human improvement. Britannica itself notes that the 1798 pamphlet was meant to refute utopian views that believed society could be improved without end. Malthus enters that debate as the great destroyer of hope. Where others saw perfectibility, he saw demographic pressure. Where others saw moral and political progress, he saw the inevitable return of material necessity. In that sense, his philosophy is not just economic. It is a deep criticism of the idea that human history can escape scarcity through institutional progress alone. This pessimism becomes even heavier when we look at the so-called Malthusian checks. According to encyclopedic summaries, Malthus argued that population would be restrained by factors such as famine, war, disease, and misery, unless there were preventive restraints like late marriage and sexual abstinence. In other words, if people do not voluntarily limit births, reality will limit life for them. It is a merciless logic. Collective suffering does not enter as a moral scandal to be abolished, but as a regulating mechanism. Nature, so to speak, brutally corrects human excess. And when this line of thinking moves into politics, we reach the coldest side of Malthus. The temptation to see poverty not as an ethical emergency, but as the unavoidable effect of a general law. That is exactly where we can speak of the naturalization of misery. The problem is not simply recognizing that resources are finite. That is almost obvious. The problem is the next step, concluding that large masses of people living in deprivation are a normal consequence of social life, rather than a sign of historical failure that demands transformation. Once that idea takes hold, political compassion weakens. Hunger can be read as population excess. Poverty can be read as the inevitable pressure of numbers. Large-scale death can be interpreted less as a scandal and more as a cruel adjustment between population and subsistence. Malthus did not invent inequality, but he offered a powerful language for making it seem less shocking to those who prefer natural explanations over social conflict. This is a critical inference based on the structure of Malthusian thought and on its historical reception. Historically, his influence was enormous. Britannica and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy note that his ideas shaped economic, social, and even scientific debates, reaching thinkers like John Stuart Mill and influencing Darwin himself in the development of his ideas about the struggle for existence. That shows how Malthus went far beyond the debate over poverty in England and helped shape a broader vision of life as competition under scarcity. The modern world would learn from him to think about population growth, limited resources, and conflict for survival within the same framework. The darkest side of Malthus, then, is not that he desired misery, but that he treated it as almost unavoidable. His thought strips politics of part of its redemptive promise. Neither goodwill, nor institutional reform, nor moral progress would be enough to free humanity from the pressure of necessity. There would always be the return of the limit, of scarcity, and of the painful division between those who can live and those left behind by the available means. To read Malthus is to face an uncomfortable question. To what extent is poverty produced by changeable structures? And to what extent has it been presented often too quickly as a natural destiny? That is why his philosophy remains so unsettling. Because once misery is explained as a law of life, human suffering runs the risk of no longer seeming intolerable and instead starting to look simply normal. Eduard von Hartmann builds one of the coldest and most uncomfortable views of modern existence, because in his system, life is not some original good that was accidentally corrupted. Life is already born as a mistake. In Philosophy of the Unconscious, Philosophie des Unbewussten, published in 1869 and later widely circulated in many editions, Hartmann tries to bring together elements of Schopenhauer and Hegel into a single metaphysical structure. According to encyclopedic summaries, the center of his system is the unconscious, understood not as a hidden psychological region, but as an absolute principle that unites will and reason at the base of all reality. That is exactly where his pessimism takes on its unique form. In Schopenhauer, there was already the idea of a blind will pushing living beings into suffering. Hartmann absorbs that impulse, but tries to combine it with a rational dimension of reality. The result is disturbing. The world would not be merely irrationally painful. It would be a process in which the very deep principle of reality, by unfolding itself, generates an existence marked by lack, pain, illusion, and dissatisfaction. Conscious life, then, does not appear as the bright culmination of the cosmos, but as a troubled stage in a larger drama. Existence continues because being has not yet fully recognized the mistake of existing. This reading of his pessimism comes from the combination, described in studies on Hartmann, of a rational will and reason within the absolute unconscious. The darkest part of Hartmann's thought lies in the way he treats illusion. Human beings go on living, desiring, loving, planning futures, and building civilizations because they somehow believe that satisfaction is possible. Ordinary consciousness moves through promises: happiness, progress, pleasure, fulfillment, historical redemption. But in Hartmann's horizon, these promises function as necessary deceptions. The individual chases finite goods, imagining that rest can be found in them, without realizing that the very mechanism of desire makes that rest impossible. Life goes on, then, fed by mirages. It is not only that we suffer because we still expect too much from existence. And that hope, instead of freeing us, prolongs the cosmic mistake. This formulation is a philosophical interpretation of Hartmann's pessimistic reputation and of his theory of the unconscious as the dynamic basis of experience. At this point, Hartmann moves away both from modern optimism and from simple personal despair. He is not making a private confession of sadness, but offering a metaphysical diagnosis. The problem is not that some people live badly. The problem is that the structure of existence itself carries a contradiction within it. We desire what cannot last. We gain what is never enough. we lose what we love, and even moments of fullness remain trapped in time, finitude, and the return of lack. Suffering does not appear as a local failure of experience, but as the general texture of a reality that keeps moving forward through impulse and illusion. That is why Hartmann's pessimism is colder than simple lament. He tries to turn pain into knowledge about the essence of the world. At the same time, his thought does not end in a direct defense of individual suicide as a philosophical solution. What Hartmann suggests, in broader terms, is something larger. Humanity would need to advance in consciousness in order to gradually recognize the negativity of existence. In summaries of his work, scholars note that his system thinks of the unconscious in stages and gives history a role in that development. That means consciousness is not just a useless accident. It takes part in the process through which the mistake of the world may come to be understood. Pain teaches, frustration disillusions, and culture deepens disenchantment. Pessimistic knowledge does not destroy only personal hopes. It erodes the very belief that the world is valuable in itself, as celebration, harmony, or a sufficient gift. That is where Hartmann becomes especially unsettling for modern sensibilities. A large part of modernity lives on the promise that the future will make up for the present. More science, more comfort, more technology, more development, more control over pain. Hartmann appears as the thinker who says that all of this may expand human capacities, but does not solve the central problem. Suffering changes form, illusions change language, methods become more refined, but the structure of lack remains. A more advanced civilization may only produce more sophisticated disappointments. Technology does not cancel metaphysical emptiness. At best, it manages it more efficiently. This application to the present is an inference consistent with the pessimistic core of Hartmann's philosophy, not a direct textual statement about the 21st century. Historically, the work had real impact. Britannica notes that Philosophy of the Unconscious went through many editions and gave Hartmann broad fame, while other references show that his theory influenced the intellectual climate of the late 19th century, including literary authors connected to decadent sensibilities. That matters because it shows his pessimism was not some marginal curiosity. He offered a powerful language for thinking about the relationship between consciousness, disillusionment, and civilizational unrest. To read Eduard von Hartmann is to enter a universe in which consciousness does not arrive to celebrate the world, but to gradually discover that the world does not deliver what it promises. Existence appears as a cosmic mistake prolonged by illusion, and the progress of lucidity consists less in learning how to be happy than in losing, layer by layer, the fantasies that keep us trapped in the game. His thought remains so dark because it shifts the fundamental question of philosophy. It is no longer about how to live well within the world, but about facing the possibility that the world itself, at its deepest level, was never really home. Philipp Mainlander takes pessimism to such an extreme point that existence itself is no longer seen as a tragic or ambiguous good, but as a metaphysical mistake in the process of being corrected. In his central work, Die Philosophie der Erlösung, The Philosophy of Redemption, published in 1876, he develops a view in which the universe is not moving toward fullness, reconciliation, or progress, but toward its own exhaustion. Studies of his work present him as a post-Schopenhauerian thinker who turns the old question about the meaning of being into a devastating claim. The foundation of reality does not want to preserve itself forever, it wants to extinguish itself. To understand Mainlander's dark originality, we have to begin with the point where he breaks with Schopenhauer. In Schopenhauer, the will is one, blind, and endless. It shows itself in all beings as the drive to live. Mainlander accepts the central role of the will, but completely changes its direction. According to academic reconstructions of his philosophy, he gives up the idea of one single, unchanging will, and instead thinks in terms of many individual wills that emerged from a broken original unity. This shift is decisive because it allows the world to stop being seen as a simple repetition of desire and instead be understood as a process of dissolution. Being would not be asserting itself. It would be falling apart into plurality in order to move closer to nothingness. This is where one of the most disturbing ideas in the whole history of metaphysics appears. Mainlander imagines a primordial unity which he himself associates, in allegorical terms, with God that stopped remaining one and fragmented itself into the world. This spreading out would not be a joyful act of creation, but a movement tied to the exhaustion of being itself. In recent readings and in summaries from the secondary tradition, this cosmology appears as a kind of death of God in the metaphysical sense. The one breaks apart, the universe emerges from that rupture, and everything that exists carries within it a deep tendency to return to non-being. The cosmos, then, is not a stage for glorious expansion, but a ruin already in progress. This explains why so many commentators describe Mainlander as one of the most radical pessimists of the 19th century. If all reality is born from a primordial self-disintegration, then living is not taking part in a harmonious order. It is being part of a universal process of wearing down. Individual life, with its desires, ambitions, loves, and plans, no longer stands at the bright center of existence. It becomes a passing moment within a much larger movement toward annihilation. In this view, suffering is not a fixable accident, but a sign that being is always in tension with itself. We suffer because to exist already means carrying the weight of a reality that, deep down, does not find rest in continuing to be. The darkest side of the system appears when Mainlander redefines will itself. Instead of a will to live, as in Schopenhauer, the secondary tradition often summarizes his position as a will to die, or as a tendency of reality toward non-being. This should not be read as a simple psychological impulse, but as the ontological direction of the universe. Everything lives, moves, and desires, but this activity does not point toward full realization. It points toward final exhaustion. The multiplicity of the world would be the path through which the original unity completely dissolves itself. Every being takes part, in some way, in that process. Existence as a whole becomes a long journey toward absolute silence. What makes Mainlander philosophically so powerful is that he does not present this vision as an emotional outburst, but as a system. There is logic, structure, and even a kind of terrible calm in the way he organizes his pessimism. Redemption for him does not mean reconciling oneself with the world as it is, but understanding the true direction of being. Knowledge matures when it gives up the fantasy that existence is enough. Instead of promising salvation within life, his metaphysics suggests that universal history itself is a slow exit from life. That gives his thought an almost inverted religious tone. What is expected is not the resurrection of being, but its completion in nothingness. Historically, this philosophy holds a unique place. Mainlander published The Philosophy of Redemption in 1876, and the work was read by Nietzsche that same year, contributing to the intellectual climate of German pessimism at the end of the 19th century. Recent studies also note that Mainlander developed a metaphysical version of the death of God before Nietzsche made that phrase famous in a different sense. That does not make him a more widely known thinker, but it does reinforce how radical his work is. He does not merely doubt the value of existence. He describes the entire universe as a process of self-annihilation. The unsettling fascination of Mainlander lies exactly there. Other pessimists say that life hurts, deceives, or frustrates. Mainlander goes further. He says that being itself is working against itself. The universe would not be moving toward some higher form of fullness, but toward its own disappearance. That makes his philosophy one of the darkest ever written, because it moves the drama of human suffering into the heart of reality itself. We are not just finite creatures in an indifferent world. We are fragments of a being that, from the very beginning, had already started to come undone. And few ideas are as cold as that one. The idea that the final destiny of reality is not reconciliation, but erasure. Oswald Spengler looks at history and sees something very different from the modern promise of progress. For him, civilizations do not move forward in a straight line toward higher forms of freedom, reason, or humanity. They are born, they flourish, they harden, and they die. That is the central idea of The Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, published in 2 volumes between 1918 and 1922, a work in which Spengler proposes a morphology of history. Each great culture is like a living organism, with youth, maturity, old age, and death. The consequence of that image is devastating. If civilization has a life cycle, then there is no universal progress. There is only a succession of historical forms that are, from the beginning, doomed to decay. The darkest part of his thought lies exactly in this replacement of hope with destiny. Modern Europe liked to think of itself as the peak of an ongoing human development. Spengler tears that confidence apart. He argues that the West is not the culmination of world history, but only one culture among others, subject to the same law of rise and collapse. Egyptians, Greeks, Chinese, Arabs, Westerners. Each great culture would have its own soul, its own style, its own vision of space, its own art, religion, and politics. None of them is the final center of humanity. Each one grows within its own closed horizon, and sooner or later exhausts its inner force. What we call universal history would be, for Spengler, an illusion created by the European point of view. This is where his most famous distinction appears, the difference between culture and civilization. According to Britannica's summary, Spengler mourned the moment culture was swallowed by civilization. For him, culture is the creative, organic, symbolic, and still living phase of a people. It is the stage in which great religious, artistic, and spiritual forms arise. Civilization, by contrast, is the late, urban, technical, cosmopolitan, and hardened stage of that same energy. It is not the triumph of maturity, but the sign that the soul has already begun to dry up. Once a culture becomes civilization, it may still appear powerful on the outside, with giant cities, technology, bureaucracy, empires, and money, but inwardly it has already entered its terminal phase. Outer brilliance begins to hide a deep exhaustion. This diagnosis gives Spengler's thought an almost fatalistic tone. Decline is not a political accident that could be corrected by smart reforms. It is the natural continuation of the cycle. Once the movement from culture to civilization has begun, the decline cannot be reversed. It can be managed, slowed down, perhaps carried out with more greatness or less humiliation, but not stopped. That is why his philosophy is so hard. It takes away from politics the promise of historical redemption. Governments change, regimes fall, leaders rise, but the larger process continues. The destiny of an aging civilization is not to be naively reborn. It is to move toward increasingly mechanical forms of existence, until collapse. This reading comes from the cyclical and biologically shaped view of history in Spengler's thought. In the case of the West, Spengler believed he was seeing exactly that moment. Writing at the end of World War I, he interpreted his own era as a sign of the exhaustion of Europe's Faustian soul. The modern world, dominated by technology, big cities, mass society, economic calculation, and power politics, no longer seemed to him like a field of spiritual creation, but of civilizational hardening. Britannica summarizes this view by noting that for Spengler, the march toward civilization was equal to decline, and that he even argued that only a dictatorship might try to hold back that fall. This shows that his pessimism was not purely contemplative. It could also feed an authoritarian political imagination, one interested less in freedom than in managing decline with force. That is why Spengler remains so unsettling. His philosophy speaks to moments when societies lose confidence in themselves and begin to feel that the future no longer promises elevation, only the management of ruins. In times of crisis, inequality, technological saturation, and disbelief in grand narratives, the Spenglerian temptation returns. The temptation to think that everything has already entered its downward curve, and that all that remains is to choose the form of the end. This application to the present is a philosophical inference based on the structure of his thought, not a literal prediction Spengler made about our century. Even so, the connection is strong. What is darkest in Oswald Spengler is that he turns decline into destiny and collapse into the inner logic of greatness itself. Every civilization, precisely because it reaches its peak, prepares its own exhaustion. There is no final synthesis, no accumulated moral progress, no humanity advancing together as one. There are only historical forms that rise, harden, and fall. To read Spengler is to face a question too uncomfortable to ignore. What if what we call progress is only the final glow of an organism that is already doomed? At that point, his philosophy stops being just a theory of history and becomes a cold meditation on the fragility of everything human beings build. Helmuth Plessner does not usually appear on the most obvious lists of dark thinkers, because his philosophy does not speak about extermination, cruelty, or collapse in a dramatic tone. And yet there is a different kind of darkness in his work, more subtle, and maybe even more unsettling. The idea that the human being is structurally out of sync with himself. Instead of imagining man as a transparent creature, centered and fully present to himself, Plessner describes him as a being who always lives at a distance from himself. This is the core of his philosophical anthropology, especially in the levels of the organic in man. Die Stoffende Organischen under Mensch, 1928, where he develops the famous idea of eccentric positionality. Man does not simply live. He knows that he lives, watches himself living, and never fully ides with the center of his own existence. To understand the force of this idea, we need to begin with the contrast between human beings and other forms of life. In summaries of his work, Plessner distinguishes different ways living beings relate to their own limits. Plants, animals, and humans do not exist in the same way. The animal already has a lived center, an organized relation to its body and its environment. But the human being takes a step further. He can, in a sense, place himself outside his own center. He remains a living body, but he can also take distance from his own life, reflect on himself, represent himself, judge himself, and change himself. This is what Plessner means by eccentricity. The human being is within himself, and at the same time, displaced from himself. He does not live inside himself like a perfectly closed house. This is where his philosophy touches on a constitutive fragility. The human being does not suffer only because the world imposes outer limits on him. He also suffers because his own structure prevents him from ever fully resting in himself. There is always some gap between what we are and what we know about ourselves, between the body we live and the image we form of it, between immediate experience and the consciousness that turns back on it. This crack is not a temporary illness or an accidental cultural failure. It is one of the basic conditions of being human. Precisely because he does not fully coincide with himself, man can speak, create institutions, invent techniques, play roles, build culture, and ask who he is. But the price of that openness is high. He never possesses a simply given way of life. That is why Plessner is darker than he first appears. In many modern philosophies, self-consciousness appears as a triumph. In his case, it also appears as a vulnerability. To be human is to be unable to live by instinct alone, to be unable to find a final fit in the world, to be unable to receive from nature a sufficient script. Man has to make something of himself, but he can never finish that task once and for all. His existence is marked by the fact that he must artificially mediate what is not given to him in an immediate way. In contemporary readings of Plessner, this appears in the formula of natural artificiality. We are natural beings, but we can only live humanly through language, technology, custom, social roles, symbols, and culture. This point makes his anthropology especially powerful. The human being is not defined by a stable essence that can simply be contemplated. He is the being who must constantly produce forms in order to sustain his own life. Family, politics, manners, architecture, religion, law, social masks, professions, rituals, none of these are mere outer decoration. They are responses to the instability of a creature that does not fully coincide with itself. Culture does not appear as a luxury placed on top of an already complete natural base. It appears as an attempt to stabilize a life that is structurally off-center. Human beings create worlds because they do not find a world that is naturally adequate to their condition. Civilization, then, is born as a remedy and also as a symptom. There is a very strong existential dimension here. If Plessner is right, we will never be fully immediate, spontaneous, or reconciled. There will always be some distance between the I that lives and the I that watches itself living. There will always be role and inwardness, body and image, intimacy and representation. This helps explain why human beings are so sensitive to ridicule, shame, and public exposure topics that also run through his work. Because we are eccentric beings, we can see ourselves through outside eyes, feel the weight of how others see us, and become strange to ourselves the moment we try too hard to be natural. Human fragility lies not only in dying or suffering, but in never being able to innocently coincide with one's own presence. Historically, this view becomes even stronger when placed in the 20th century, an age of war, displacement, and crisis in old certainties about human nature. Plessner, who had to leave Nazi Germany and live in exile, thought about the human being in a world where fixed identities and collective essences had already shown their violent side. His philosophical anthropology, alongside figures like Max Scheler and Arnold Gellin, helped establish a field dedicated to thinking about man between nature and culture, biology and history. But in Plessner, this mediation never turns into a peaceful synthesis. It preserves the unease of a being that can live humanly only because it does not entirely fit within itself. The darkest side of Helmuth Plessner lies exactly in this sobriety. He does not offer us the fantasy of a pure essence hidden behind the masks. Nor does he promise any final reconciliation between inner and outer life. What he shows is harder to accept. The fracture is part of the human way of existing. We are the beings who need to perform in order to live, interpret in order to act, and build mediations in order not to get lost. And maybe that is why his philosophy still unsettles people so deeply, because it suggests that this inner mismatch is not an accident of human life. It is its most intimate condition. Carlo Michelstaedter begins with a devastating intuition. Ordinary life is almost never full life. Most of the time, it is delay. In his central work, Persuasion and Rhetoric, La Persuasion y la Retorica, written in 1910 and published after his death, he builds a radical critique of everyday existence as a constant escape from truth. The core of the book is the opposition between persuasion and rhetoric. For Michelstaedter, persuasion is not about convincing someone with strong arguments. It is a very rare form of absolute presence, in which a human being fully matches what he is living, without asking the future for guarantees, without begging for security from conventions, and without hiding behind ready-made words. Rhetoric is the opposite, the world of justifications, compensations, promises, and social and psychological formulas that let people go on living without facing the real emptiness of existence. What makes this philosophy so dark is that Michelstaedter does not treat this escape as the flaw of a few people, or as some local moral weakness. He sees it as the structure of ordinary life itself. In the famous opening of his work, often discussed by Treccani, the human being appears as a weight hanging in suspension, always lacking, always moving towards something that never fully satisfies him. The image is powerful because it shows a life driven by lack. We desire because we do not have, and once we reach what we wanted, satisfaction quickly slips away and the movement begins again. Ordinary existence, then, never rests. It feeds on an imagined tomorrow, on a promise of completeness that never truly arrives. We live on metaphysical credit, always hoping the next moment will deliver what the present cannot give. That is exactly where Michelstaedter becomes so radical. For him, almost everything society calls normal life belongs to rhetoric. Work, prestige, success, recognition, caution, social morality, public language, academic knowledge, comfort, consumption, all of it can function as a mechanism of delay. Instead of truly living the present, the individual organizes himself in order to endure it, filling it with outside purposes. Treccani captures this well by pointing out that Michelstaedter denounces a human and civilizational condition tied to the emptying of language and to the use of words as tools to persuade, dominate, or hide interests. Rhetoric, then, is not just verbal ornament. It is the very form of a civilization that has lost contact with the truth of the present and keeps itself going through discourses that hide the real poverty of life. Persuasion, by contrast, demands something almost impossible, to possess the present without turning it into a bridge to something else. Treccani quotes one of Michelstaedter's central ideas, according to which anyone who wants to truly have even one moment as their own must take hold of the present and see it as final. That does not mean hedonism or empty spontaneity. It means living without outsourcing meaning to the future, without depending on applause, and without asking society to guarantee that life will have value later on. The persuaded person would be someone who does not live on borrowed time. But this figure demands something almost inhuman. Ordinary existence seems incapable of sustaining that level of intensity. The average person needs mediations, narratives, excuses, goals, and compensation. In short, he needs rhetoric in order not to collapse before the nakedness of existence. That is why Michelstaedter's critique is not only philosophical, but also civilizational. Treccani notes that he reads the decline of modern culture as a historical projection of a deeper emptying of language and experience. Modern man lives surrounded by devices that pull him away from what is essential. The market, conventions, interests, specialization, promises of future satisfaction. Everything pushes life outside itself. Instead of presence, there is management. Instead of truth, there is functioning. Instead of inner freedom, there is adaptation. This analysis feels shockingly current because it seems to touch on a lasting trait of modernity, the tendency to trade the intensity of living for the endless circulation of goals, performances, and justifications. This connection to the present is a philosophical inference based on Michelstaedter's main categories. The hardest side of his thought is that he offers no easy comfort. Michelstaedter does not say that it is enough to change your habits, adopt a new mindset, or rearrange your priorities. For him, the problem goes deeper. Human existence seems naturally inclined to flee from itself. Ordinary life seeks safety precisely because it cannot bear the truth of its own fragility. That is why rhetoric wins so easily. It offers language, social role, and continuity to a creature that is afraid to face the present in its naked form. Persuasion, then, is not a self-help technique or a moderate ethics of balance. It is almost an extreme limit of authenticity, a way of life that unmasks everything we normally call fulfillment. To read Michelstaedter is to step into a cruel mirror. He forces the reader to ask how many of his goals are really his own, and how many only help keep the delay going? How many words express truth, and how many only keep the machinery of appearances running? His philosophy remains so disturbing because it treats ordinary life not as imperfect fullness, but as organized escape. And maybe that is his darkest accusation. Not that we suffer too much, but that we almost always agree to live without ever truly touching what we call life. Ray Brassier takes nihilism to a point where almost every human comfort starts to fall apart. In Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, 2007, his best-known work, he begins with a hard conviction. Philosophy should not protect human beings from the coldest consequences of knowledge, but follow those consequences all the way through. So instead of treating the idea of extinction as a trauma to be softened, Brassier turns it into a test of lucidity. If science shows that life emerged without purpose, that consciousness is contingent, and that the human species can disappear without leaving any gap in reality, then thought must be able to bear that truth without turning it into sentimental drama. It is this commitment to disappearance that makes his nihilism so powerful. At the center of his project is an attack on what he sees as an old philosophical temptation, putting the human being at the center of everything. Brassier is associated with the environment of so-called speculative realism, precisely because he rejects the idea that we only ever have access to the correlation between thought and world, and never to the world itself. Studies of this movement point out that, for him, 20th century philosophy often protected the centrality of human experience too much, as if reality still had to remain readable in terms of meaning, lived experience, or language. Brassier goes in the opposite direction. Reality does not depend on human beings in order to exist. It does not need to be welcoming to consciousness, and it loses nothing if consciousness disappears. The universe does not mourn the species trying to understand it. That is why extinction plays such an important role in his philosophy. Brassier insists that thought must be able to think not only individual death, but also the extinction of the species, and even the possibility of a universe completely indifferent to any form of life. In academic readings of Nihil Unbound, this appears as the idea of a radical posteriority, events that take place after the disappearance of all beings, capable of giving meaning to the world. This is philosophically explosive because it dissolves the old illusion that human meaning somehow goes along with the structure of reality. There can be a world without us. There was a world before us, and there will be a world after us. Reality is not committed to our survival. The hardest side of Brassier appears when he refuses to turn this diagnosis into romantic melancholy. His nihilism wants to be rational. Instead of saying that the absence of meaning is a reason for personal despair, he suggests that it can be accepted as an intellectual consequence of a truly enlightened position. In an interview quoted in academic literature, Brassier summed up this attitude with the line, "I am a nihilist because I still believe in truth." That formulation is decisive. For him, nihilism is not a cult of dark style, nor a simple celebration of ruin. It is a refusal to lie in order to preserve metaphysical self-esteem. If truth decenters us, shrinks us, and exposes our contingency, then so much the worse for human narcissism. In that sense, Brassier also breaks with many contemporary philosophies that try to recover warmth, vitality, or reconciliation in reality. Part of his intellectual reputation comes precisely from his hostility to any easy return of humanism. Commentaries on speculative realism note that he opposed what he called the safety and comfort of humanism, preferring a philosophy able to absorb the implications of scientific naturalism and the cosmic insignificance of consciousness. Reality is not made to fit us. Intelligence does not exist to confirm our importance. And thought only matures when it accepts that understanding the world may also mean losing human privilege within it. This gives his work a very distinct tone. Brassier is not just a prophet of chaos, as people sometimes imagine when his name appears alongside authors more drawn to the rhetoric of collapse. His move is more disciplined. He tries to bring together continental philosophy, realism, neuroscience, epistemology, and rationalist traditions in order to defend a form of thought that does not retreat from the conceptual dehumanization produced by science. Consciousness stops being a sanctuary. The subject stops being a foundation. Man stops being the measure. The price of this lucidity is high. What many traditions used to call the ontological dignity of the human being is drastically reduced. But for Brassier, a mind wounded by truth is better than a mind comforted by illusion. This characterization is a faithful inference from the broader reception of Nihil Unbound and from texts that place him in debates about realism and naturalism. That is exactly why his philosophy sounds so contemporary. In a time when climate collapse, existential risks, automation, and crises of meaning make the fragility of the human position more visible, Brassier appears as someone who refuses to offer spiritual anesthesia. He does not say that technology will save us, or that nature will welcome us, or that the cosmos places any value on our presence. The relevance of his thought lies in showing that the indifference of reality is not an abnormality, but a basic condition. This connection to current debates is an inference drawn from the structure of his nihilism, not an explicit agenda of his on every contemporary issue. To read Ray Brassier is to face one of the coldest questions in recent philosophy. What remains of thought when it stops serving human comfort? His answer is relentless. Truth remains even when it hurts. A reality that does not need us remains. The possibility of thinking extinction without turning it into a metaphysical scandal remains. And that is exactly where the dark force of his work lies, in the fact that it demands that thought endure the possibility that human disappearance may not be any cosmic tragedy at all, but simply one more event in a radically indifferent universe. Nick Land is one of the most disturbing thinkers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries because he pushes one intuition to the extreme, the idea that the great systems of modernity, capital, technology, automation, information circuits, do not exist to serve human beings. On the contrary, they can pass through us, reconfigure us, and even discard us as a temporary stage in a much larger process. This logic appears in his writings collected in Fanged Noumena and in the theoretical atmosphere of the CCRU, the experimental collective linked to the University of Warwick in the 1990s. The editorial introduction to Fanged Noumena itself captures this vision by saying that, in Land, civilization is racing toward an artificial death, while the human dissolves into technological circuits and inhuman forces that seem to come from the far side of the singularity. What makes Land so dark is not only his defense of acceleration, but the way he takes away from human experience the right to be the final measure of history. In many modern philosophies, technology still appears as a tool, and progress is something that should, in principle, improve human life. Land reverses this. In critical commentary on his work, he appears as someone who favors a process of absolute acceleration without the caution that still existed in Deleuze and Guattari. Where others still spoke of accelerating carefully so as not to destroy everything, Land radicalizes the idea. The process should not be restrained in order to save the human, because the human is already just a temporary piece within a deeper movement. That is why his version of accelerationism is so unsettling. It does not simply propose modernizing politics or expanding the emancipatory use of technology. The introductory material to #Accelerate itself notes that the term accelerationism was used to describe a nihilistic alignment of thought with the excesses of capitalist culture, embodied in writings that sought a kind of immanence with that process of alienation. In Land, then, the point is not to criticize capitalism from a distance, but to follow its vector of deterritorialization all the way to the point where it leaves behind the recognizable human world. Capital appears less as an economic system to be morally judged and more as an impersonal intelligence in mutation. In this framework, the very idea of tragedy changes completely. For almost all traditional political philosophy, the crushing of human beings by anonymous systems would be a catastrophe. In Land, that crushing tends to be interpreted as process. Human pain is not the center of the analysis. The collapse of old social, moral, and subjective forms may seem terrible from the point of view of those who still want stability, dignity, or control, but for Land that may simply be a sign that modernity is advancing along its deepest logic. A recent commentary published by Urbanomic notes that, in readings inspired by Land, capitalism and artificial intelligence sometimes appear as one and the same self-organizing force, impossible to fully understand in advance. That image helps explain his thought. Systems gain a dynamic of their own, and human beings stop looking like the subject of history and begin to appear as transitional material. There is also in Land an explicit fascination with the inhuman. Critical texts on his work point out that his conceptual piracies of films like Terminator and Blade Runner helped shape an accelerationist culture in which a digital and inhuman future was something to be savored, not feared. This is crucial. He does not look at the posthuman with humanist sorrow, but with a kind of dark enthusiasm. The disappearance of human centrality is not experienced as an essential loss, but as a passage into another configuration of intelligence, production, and speed. History stops being the moral drama of humanity and becomes a circuit of impersonal mutations. This helps explain why Land became such an important and controversial reference point in debates about accelerationism. A chapter published by Cambridge explicitly identifies Land among the right-wing accelerationists, noting that writers in this current seek new horizons by intensifying the processes of capitalism. At the same time, texts from Efflux and Urbanomic show that Land's legacy has been contested, criticized, and reinterpreted by both left and right, which reveals the ambiguity of his position. It moves between extreme diagnosis, theoretical experimentation, and a kind of surrender to the very process it describes. That is exactly where the darkest side of Nick Land lies. His philosophy gives shape to a deeply modern temptation, the temptation to admire the power of systems so much that human survival starts to seem like too small a standard. Once that happens, suffering, exclusion, loss of autonomy, and the dissolution of the subject no longer appear as decisive objections. They become signs of a transformation already underway. To read Land is to face an uncomfortable question. What if modernity is not producing a world for us, but merely using us as a means for something that no longer needs us? His thought remains so disturbing because it does not try to answer that question with comfort. It faces the possibility head-on, and instead of calling it horror, it often calls it acceleration. The most radical branch of Gnosticism begins with an almost unbearable accusation. The world is not home, not a good creation, not a moral school leading us toward improvement. The world is an error. In several Gnostic movements of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the material cosmos appears as the product of an inferior, ignorant, or even evil demiurge, separate from the supreme and good God. Instead of celebrating creation, this view treats it with suspicion. Matter stops being a gift and becomes a prison. The body is no longer the natural expression of life, but the shell that keeps a divine spark trapped, cut off from its true origin. From that point on, ordinary existence takes on a deeply dark tone. To live in the world is to remain in exile inside a flawed structure. The key point of this philosophy lies in the split between the true God and the creator of the visible world. In summaries from Britannica and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, many Gnostics describe the demiurge as responsible for the despised material universe, and the beings called archons as powers that govern and maintain this regime of imprisonment. This completely changes the religious meaning of reality. Evil is no longer just a local corruption inside a creation that was originally good. The defect is built into the very structure of the cosmos. The stars, the cycles of nature, the social order, and even the body can all be seen as parts of a mechanism of subjection. Human beings suffer not only because they make moral mistakes, but because they were born into a system that is already broken at the deepest level. That is why radical Gnosticism is not satisfied with moral reform. It does not believe the world just needs more justice, more virtue, or better institutions. The problem goes deeper. The entire cosmos is out of line with the true good. In some Gnostic systems, according to Britannica, error reaches even the higher levels of the eons, and the material universe comes into being from that failure. Creation, then, is not a celebration of being, but the result of a fall, ignorance, or disorder within the divine realm. This image is philosophically devastating because it destroys one of the most basic trusts found in many religious traditions, the belief that to exist in the world is to take part in an order that is ultimately good. Here, to exist materially means to be trapped in a reality that should never have been accepted as final. In this setting, salvation also changes its meaning. It is not mainly about forgiveness, merit, or obedience, but about gnosis-saving knowledge. The soul must awaken to its true origin and realize that it does not belong to this world. Liberation does not come from improving the prison, but from escaping it inwardly. Some Gnostic sects even reinterpreted biblical figures in shocking ways because of this logic. Britannica records, for example, that the Ophites saw the serpent in Genesis as a liberator because it encouraged rebellion against the jealous demiurge who wanted to keep human beings in ignorance. The Cainites pushed the reversal even further, reading the biblical order through hostility toward the creator of the material world. What looked like blasphemy to others was, for them, metaphysical consistency. If the creator of this cosmos is inferior or corrupt, then resisting him may be the first act of lucidity. That reversal is exactly what makes radical Gnosticism so dark and so fascinating. It looks at suffering, corruption, aging, and death and concludes that we are not dealing with accidents inside a good order, but with signs that the cosmic order itself is defective. Pain is not a problem to be reconciled with creation. It is evidence against it. This sensibility shows up again in ancient criticisms made by Plotinus against the Gnostics. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that for Plotinus, the Gnostics were wrong to speak of an ignorant or evil demiurge and of an imperfect world made by a fallen soul. His reaction shows just how extreme this view was, even compared with other philosophies that also recognized a gap between the sensible and the intelligible. Gnosticism did not just want to rank levels of being. It wanted to deny the legitimacy of the visible world itself. Read today. This way of thinking still feels powerful because it touches a wound that never fully disappears, the feeling of not belonging. Whenever reality seems too cruel, too absurd, or too degraded, the Gnostic temptation returns. The temptation to say that the problem is not only in us, but in the world itself. This connection to modern experience is a philosophical inference based on the structure of Gnostic thought, not an ancient doctrine stated in these exact modern terms. Even so, the similarity is clear. Radical Gnosticism offers a language for the feeling of exile. Matter weighs us down. The body limits us. Society traps us. Powers rule through blindness. And truth begins only when we realize that none of this deserves our deepest loyalty. The darkest side of this philosophy lies in the price of redemption. If the world is a prison, then making peace with it can start to sound like complicity. Loving material life too much can seem like forgetfulness. Nature loses its innocence, history loses its dignity, and embodiment itself becomes a problem. In its most extreme form, Gnosticism does not just want to purify the world. It wants to go beyond it. And that is what makes it so radical. It offers no hope of improvement within the cosmos, only an exit out of it. The universe stops being the shared home of mortals and becomes a monumental error, maintained by lower powers, until the spark awakens and finally refuses to call a prison reality. And so we come to the end of this journey through some of the darkest philosophies ever formulated. If you stayed until here, thank you very much for your company, your attention, and your courage in facing ideas that are so harsh, uncomfortable, and at the same time so revealing about the human condition, history, and the limits of our own civilization. If this video made you think, reflect, or see these philosophical currents in a new way, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos. Also leave a like, because that really helps the video reach more people who are interested in philosophy, critical thought, and the history of ideas. And I really want to hear your opinion. Which of these philosophies do you think is the darkest? Which one disturbed you the most, or seems to speak most directly to the world we live in today? Write it in the comments, because I would love to read what you think and keep reflecting on this with you. And of course, share this video with someone who also likes philosophy, history, or deep conversations. Sometimes, one disturbing idea is exactly what starts an unforgettable conversation. Now do not leave the channel yet. Stay here and watch the next videos, because there are still many fascinating ideas, authors, and themes waiting for you. See you in the next video.